Good morning. This is the BLAINESWORLD Show, now seen each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and you can find us other places as well. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week we focus on the Asheville theater scene, as well as on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce Stu Helm. And Stu, before I do the introduction, you can wave to all your fans and friends on Facebook and everywhere else. And
Hey,
that's
everybody.
that's Stu Helm. Stu has lived in Asheville for nearly 17 years, moving here from Chicago. He grew up in and around Boston. I had to say Boston, right?
Yeah.
He worked as an illustrator for 20 years, then switched to food blogging and writing, and he's very involved, as you'll see, in the Asheville food scene. Definitely someone to know when it comes to discovering the latest news with restaurants, food trucks, and more. He enjoys introducing visitors and locals to the downtown area, walking and sampling delicious cuisine as an enthusiastic guide for Asheville food tours. And the question, Stu, I always ask is, we already mentioned you grew up in and around Boston. When you were a little kid, did you always know you wanted to be a foodie?
No, I had no idea. This came out of nowhere. I,
As a
I
kid,
wanted
what do
to
you
be
want
an
to be?
artist. I wanted to be an artist. That was my goal, and I am happy to say I achieved that goal. Went to art school, graduated from art school, and went on to have a art career. Made my living drawing pictures for almost 20 or exactly 20 years, and then I just stumbled into writing about food, and I kind of ditched my art career in order to focus on food.
When you were doing the art career, did you emphasize food at all, or did you draw pictures of food?
Yeah, I drew. I mean, I didn't emphasize it, but
Right.
I drew lots of pictures of food for sure. Like, oh my God, lots of hot dogs and pieces of pizza, and I was a commercial artist as well as uh, drew pictures just for myself, and so food is part of life, and I drew pictures of people doing stuff.
As a kid, did you like all different kinds of foods?
I was pretty open-minded as a kid. I had a I had an aversion to onions and peppers, which kind of got in my way, but only bell peppers. I didn't even know there was any other kind of pepper because I grew up in the suburbs, and or not the suburbs. I grew up in a small town, and but I didn't like them. But as I grew up, I came to realize I didn't like the way that people prepared them, which was they didn't cook them well enough, and I still have sort of an aversion to bell peppers. I just don't like. I'm not that big of a fan. What can I say? But other kinds of peppers, love them. Jalapenos, serranos, give them.
Do you have an aversion to any other kinds of foods?
Not really. I'm not a fan of like certain kinds of offal. Like I do eat kidneys and chicken livers and hog hash and stuff like that, but I do not like calves brains, which is sometimes on menus. Just a little too loosey goosey and wiggly jiggly for me. But but only like little things here and there, not like broad categories. You meet people who are like, well, I don't like fruit or whatever. But no, there's only specific foods here and there that are just either too much for me, or there's a couple that I don't eat foie gras. Or I should say I don't order foie gras, and that's for political reasons, I guess you could say, or personal reasons. And but if it's on a plate and it's already there, I'll eat it. I'm not. I mean, I love it. It's delicious, but for political reasons, I don't order it. And that is more recently true about octopus. And octopus, I am not the hugest fan of, anyways. I like it when it's done really well. Unfortunately, it's not always done really well, and then it's kind of gross. But knowing what we know about octopuses now, or octopi, however you want to say it, I'm just not down with eating them.
Was your mom a good cook?
Yeah, my mom's a great cook.
Okay. And so now, have you also become a good cook?
Yes, I'm a good cook. I like to cook, and my mom taught me some basics about how to cook pieces of meat and pieces of fish and how to make a cheese sauce. And once you know how to make a cheese sauce, the world is your oyster, and you can do pretty much anything from there. And yeah, I know what I like, and I cook food that I like, and it seems like other people like it too.
When you were doing the illustrating stuff, did you ever want to become own a restaurant or run a restaurant? And have you ever done that?
You know what, Blaine? I think most of us have fantasized about owning and running a restaurant. I really do. I think it's one of the innate desires of human beings to share their cooking with others. I mean, some people just don't like to cook,
Right.
so let's take them right off the board. But people who like to cook, I think, would like to share what they like to do with food with other people. It's part of the joy of cooking. So, yeah, and also I have an entrepreneurial mind. Um, I'm not trying to say I'm some sort of major entrepreneur or anything, but I like to do things, work for myself. And so I have thought about it for sure. I have never owned a restaurant, and I don't know that I ever would. I mean, I still fantasize about it or think about it. I know from being a food writer that it's a lot of work to run a restaurant. It's a lot more work than being a food writer, for example.
Well, I guess to ease into it and certainly become very popular in Nashville, you could always open a food truck, I guess, and boy, has that been, talk a little bit about that, Stu, what's happened in Nashville, I guess, what, in the last 10 years, it's all of a sudden become food truck haven, it's just incredible. But right,
Yeah.
that's only within the last 10 years or so?
Yeah, I would say so. That's about right, Blaine. I mean, there might have been some food trucks here and there, but Chef Susie Salwa from Gypsy Queen, she really spearheaded a movement to introduce food trucks into Asheville because, there's some laws, ordinances, regulations around food trucks, and they have to be special and specific to food trucks. They can't just be the restaurant ones. And so, and then not everybody wanted food trucks. Like the restaurants did fight against the
I
food
remember.
trucks being able to park downtown, and they're still not allowed to park downtown. Now, I know that some of the restaurateurs who fought against that have regrets about that now, and they wish they had not stood against the food trucks because now they see the food truck owners as their compatriots, their fellow chefs. And so it was like standing in between their fellow chefs and success. And I know that they didn't think that at first. They just thought about their own success. My friend Joe Scully,
Sure.
he owns Chestnut. He said to me one time that I didn't want some guy parked out front selling hot dogs in front of my restaurant. And then he said, but later on, I was like, what do I care? I don't sell hot dogs. There's a pizza place right next door to me. And so, he ultimately he didn't see the difference between a hot dog truck in front of his restaurant and the pizza place next door.
Well, it's funny you say that because as a kid, I think I had this negative impression of food trucks, and where I grew up, there were never food trucks. And so just recently, Cynthia and I started eating at food trucks, and we love them. Tonight we just got pizza, and then get cheeseburgers, last night, and there's some really good food trucks.
Hmm.
It's amazing. Here's one for you though. You're saying you're starting a restaurant. I think the only thing for me, Stu, I would think it'd be really cool to start a peanut butter and jelly place, and there is one now. Have you been there?
I have not, but yeah, it's out there in Hendersonville. Is
Yeah,
that
it's
where it is?
on going into Hendersonville. I forget
Great.
the name of it right now, but great place. We'll have to check that out too. Yeah,
Yeah,
five different peanut butters, five different jellies, and just really good. Who would have thunk?
yeah. Any concept can be successful if you have the right marketing and the food tastes good.
And they
That's
seem to be. But talk a little bit about that too, Stu, which is just amazing about Asheville. But you certainly have a wide variety of foods to choose from. In terms of boy, there are a lot of different kinds of foods in Asheville.
Yeah, there certainly are. We have a great international food scene, and a lot of those are the food trucks, by the way. Food truck is a great way for anybody to jump into the food industry, and also a great way to be mobile and stuff, so that you can travel from city to city and sell. And we just have such a great variety. For one thing, we have the best Spanish tapas restaurant in the whole country, Karate. Chef Katie Button just won a James Beard Award last week. We also have, and that wasn't for best Spanish tapas, that was for best
Right.
hospitality. But I'm going to go ahead and say we've got the best Spanish tapas restaurant. We've got the best Indian street food restaurant in the whole country. Chef Marwan Irani and his team also recognized with the James Beard Award just a couple of weeks ago. And so that's not to be expected of a small town in Appalachia. Like I try to never lose sight of the fact that we are a small town in the mountains of Western North Carolina in an area called Appalachia. And you don't expect this kind of fine, or I won't say fine dining because that has a definition, but I will say really high end food in this little mountain town. And so those are just two examples of how diverse and excellent our food scene is, but there's dozens more. Like one of our success stories is a chef named Shorty, and Shorty has a food truck called Bun Intended that sells steamed bao buns
Oh, I
with
haven't been there yet.
pork.
Yeah.
Oh, it's great food truck. And now she has a space inside of the S&W cafeteria building right downtown. So that's great. Like a person starts a food truck, next thing you know, they've got the brick and mortar right in the middle of
Well,
downtown. And
talk about the one.
it wasn't next thing you know. It took years and years
Right,
of
right. But talk about the other one too. What was it? The grilled cheese food truck.
oh
It,
yeah. What's that called? It's really great. It's a
yeah,
great
just
food truck.
amazing.
Melt your heart. It's
That's
melt
it.
your
Yeah,
heart.
just love it. But talk about another thing that happened, Stu, and I think we were lucky in Asheville. But I thought because of the pandemic, we'd lose a lot more restaurants than we did. Surprisingly, it didn't seem all that bad. Would you agree with that?
I would, Blaine. I mean, from the point of view of the restaurants, it was
Well,
horrible,
sure.
but
Yeah.
they didn't. But a lot of them survived. They were able to shift their focus. They had a lot of loyal local fans that banded around them and said, "Let's keep these certain places open, everybody." By ordering from them a lot. We have a great local delivery service called Kickback that really saved a lot of restaurants by offering delivery right away. And we did lose some great restaurants. Like one of my favorites in downtown is called the Ox Bar. It closed and it was fantastic. Like it was the restaurant that I thought most exemplified the Asheville food aesthetic. It was run by Chef Stephen Goff and his excellent team of chefs and bartenders. Front of the house was great too, and they closed. But now Stephen Goff just bought the Tasty Diner out
Oh, I
in
saw that.
Westfield.
Yeah, great. Well,
So we lose one, but we don't lose the chef. The
Well,
chef
well,
is
talk about
back.
those two things you just mentioned. One having to do other places that closed down. One of my favorites was the Korean House. I just
Yeah,
loved
yeah,
it and
I
went there
agree.
all the time and just wow, it's so crushed. But you mentioned something else too, and talk a little bit about that in terms of diners because I grew up. Well, you grew up Boston area. I grew up New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. I love diners. I still contend there's not, tasting might change, but there's not a great diner, with the 12-page menu and and the 24-hour operation. Diners don't do that anymore, for the most part. But Asheville is not a big diner scene. Would you agree with that?
I think that there's a difference between diners up north and diners down south.
Right,
And so when I grew up, we would go eat in these diners that were made out of actual old train cars,
right, right.
shaped like a train car. It was a train car, like for real, like a retired train car. And they were like classic 1950s style
Yeah.
diners. But no, I haven't seen a train car diner in this
Well,
area. Maybe
well,
there is one.
you might know it, but it's not a diner anymore. But where I live on Fairview on Charlotte Highway, there's a Mexican restaurant now, but it used to be a diner. I didn't know it was a diner, but you know what I'm talking about?
I do. I forget what it's called. Nachos and beer, maybe.
Nachos and beer, not bad. We like it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I
Well,
was
me
never
too.
there
A number
for
of
when it was
times.
a diner, but that was a
Yeah.
traditional diner.
I think that was built to be retro, though. I think that was a retro
Oh, was it?
building. Yes.
And
New building.
another diner for you may have been to is in Tryon. Have you ever been to that diner?
No, I haven't.
It's right outside, the complex with the horses.
Okay.
And it's kind of, but it's not a traditional diner, but it's close to a diner. It looks like a diner. So check that
Here
out
in
sometime.
Asheville, like 5 Points is probably the closest
Close,
kind of
yeah, it's
diner
sort
that
of.
I grew up with.
And taste, there are other diners. And what was the one downtown? It's still there. They
The
changed ownership.
Mediterranean,
Yeah,
the Med. Yeah,
yeah.
the Med is fantastic. And those are, classic sort of Greek style
Right,
diners, and I grew up going to those as well in Boston. So the Mediterranean feels really comfortable to me and
right,
familiar to me. But of course, in Boston, there would be different dishes. In addition to the Greek salads and such, there would not be fried chicken. There would
right.
not be grits. There would not be, pimento cheese and stuff like that. There would be other things like northern style dishes and
Well, near me,
and
same kind of thing. There's a place, you may know it, on Charlotte Highway, Angelo's, and run by owned by a Greek guy, nice guy, but there's hardly any Greek dishes. There might be one Greek
yeah,
dish, and it's,
right.
it's a crazy combination of Italian and Greek. And the first time we went there, Stu, we had to get used to it. That you go in there and you see all these dead animals on the walls. So that my wife wasn't thrilled, but we got used to it. They're
It's
looking
like a
at you.
scene from a horror movie there, Blaine.
Well, it seems that, they're watching it as you eat, but we got used to it. So talk about something else I've admired about you since I first met you. But I'm trying to think which event it was. It may have been a cookie competition or something. But all of a sudden you got into these competitions. And talk a little bit about that because it's such a fun thing you do.
Well, thanks for bringing it up, Blaine. I've got one coming up. I've got Punk Rock Hot Dogs 2022 coming up on July 30th at the Masonic Temple. People can find tickets online on Eventbrite by just searching for Punk Rock Hot Dogs.
Now, if they
And
buy tickets, what do they get?
one ticket admits two people
Right.
who get to share all 10 hot dogs.
Oh, cool.
And we do provide some to-go wares because even two people can't eat 10 hot dogs. Um, and then they get to cast two votes in the People's Choice. So one ticket admits two people who share 10 hot dogs and cast two votes.
And how did you come up with this idea to have these competitions?
Well, food competitions are pretty
Right.
standard, and here in Asheville, we had some of the best ones in terms of the Battle of the Burger and the Wing War. And unfortunately, I don't think that those are going to come back. Those went the way of the dinosaur during COVID, and I don't think they're going to come back, Blaine. But and the person who ran those was a wonderful person named Kelly Denson. And
Okay.
Kelly had her hands full with these two competitions. She did later on start to do a mac and cheese competition, but that didn't really get rolling before 2020 came along. And so there's always been fun competitions. Kelly had her hands full with those. People were constantly asking me to do them. Like they were like, you should do this, you should do that. And so I decided to try to do some. And it's been a learning process. Let me just put it that way. So some have been more successful than others, but Punk Rock Hot Dogs is my favorite one, personally. And basically, it's 10 local competitors. We do have some that are from out of town, so that's great, that are from Western North Carolina, so expanding. And they will all be cooking hot dogs that are trying to be different and delicious. And the theme is punk rock. And this year in particular, the theme is goth, Goth, the dark look of the 90s. And they'll be judged on how goth their hot dog is. They'll be judged on how it looks, how it tastes, how creative it is, and how goth it is. And there's a judges panel, 9 judges, great judges panel of chefs and celebrities. And then there's a people's choice and there's an award for both. So there's you can actually see it in the video right behind me. There's a little trophy with a hot dog on it, and then a plaque for the People's Choice. And it's a lot of fun. We raise some money for the Masonic Temple, which is a historic building that is always in desperate need of repair. And the repairs on these big old buildings are not cheap, let me tell you. Like, just to fix the roof is like this is astronomical amount of money. But through these competitions, which I do with Shea Brown events, by the way, I should always mention that Shea Brown is my awesome partner on these events. I could not do them without them. I'm like a dreamer, and Shay makes my dreams come true, to put it simply.
How many of these have you done?
Oh gosh, I don't know, about a dozen, I would say, and we've done them in different
Right.
configurations. Before I got together with Shay, I did a bunch that were sponsored by Dig Local, the
Right. Right.
local promo company, and we did them in their office, and there was no public. admittance. It was just a panel of judges. And I was also partnered at the time with Takeout Central, which is a delivery company. And so I would get like 5 or 6 competitors, and Takeout Central would deliver. We did this one, we did a Philly cheesesteak fight, we did a mac and cheese one, we did a pimento cheese one. I think we did a couple of others. Fried chicken, we did a fried
Yeah,
chicken one.
I think I was even a judge. You did a cookie one, I think.
We did. We did that
Y-
one with WPVM.
Right, at the
Yeah.
station. Yeah, it was kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
fun. So that
Yeah,
was
it
cool. I
was.
was a judge in that one.
Yeah.
A very qualified judge, but I was a judge nevertheless. And I'm trying to think one other. You've done a pizza one, right?
Pizza. Yeah, we've
Yeah,
done pizza, donuts, pie. We did a
yeah,
pie fight. Yeah. We've done a lot, and we've done the pizza one a couple of times. This will be our third punk rock hot dogs one. As I said, some are more successful than others. The public always wants you to do them, right? Like they're just screaming for them all the time. So we do have a mac and cheese one coming up in September, and I hopefully working with Bruce Waller. I don't want to talk out of turn because
sure.
maybe Bruce can't do it, but Bruce Waller from Black Wall Street. I really want to have the black community in Asheville involved with the mac and cheese competition.
Cool. Uh, by the way, I don't know if you're on the page yet, but I think you've seen I run an entertainment page on Facebook. So sign up for that group. So any of your events, please feel free to publicize them in that as well. And I put them in my blog as well. So if you're doing something, let me know because I'd like to
I will.
help
I
spread the
will.
word. Do you have a favorite one you've ever done?
A favorite competition?
Yeah.
It's definitely punk rock hot
Oh,
dogs.
it will be? Okay.
And it was the one that we did last year. We did it in 2000, what was it, 2019, and then we had to skip 2020, and then we did
Sure.
it in 2021. And the one in 2021 was the craziest, most frenetic, frantic event of the whole year. There were just people eating hot dogs, the public overwhelmed by the amount of food they got at this thing, and so grateful that we gave them to go wares. And the judges were great. We had a couple of local pro wrestlers were on the judges panel, as well as some chefs and some eaters. I always make sure to have what I call eaters, and that would be me and you, Blaine. Like we're eaters, and eaters have a valuable opinion. We're the ones who keep the restaurants in business, for one
Sure.
thing. And when I have judges, I only ask them a few questions. Are you allergic to anything? Do you have any food restrictions or allergies? And are there any foods that you just don't like? And if the answer is yes to any of those, you basically can't be a judge.
I
Yeah.
haven't seen in this area, Stu, you might know, of too many places that have like to eat as many of the hot dog, the Nathan's hot dog eating contest. Have they
Yeah.
had in this area any eating contests like that?
I'm not aware of that. Like those have a whole different vibe to them, and you're talking about like
Right, right.
who can eat the most rather than who can make the best, right? And those are for professionals, man. Like there might be a pie eating contest associated with some church fair around here that I'm not aware of, because that would be typical to have a pie eating contest, especially the kind where you have to keep your hands behind your back,
Right, right,
So those can be a lot of fun. I used to really love watching the Nathan's hot dog
right.
competition on
Still do.
television.
Or,
Yeah.
still do every year. You have to
So
watch it.
gross though. It's
Yeah,
so gross. And around here, Blaine, I'll just tell you that people would be so turned off by the food waste of
right.
something like that.
Good
That
point.
I know from talking to people. They're like, I tell them I do food competitions, and they sometimes think I'm talking about a eating competition. They're
How
like,
about
oh, isn't that
also,
waste?
I know a couple of years ago there was one, I don't know if you've ever been involved in it, but the food truck competitions. Are they
Mhm.
still doing them, or are you going to be involved in that at all?
Well, those come around every once in a
Right,
while. The original one was actually done at the Masonic Temple with
I
a dude
remember.
named
Right,
Yeah, and that was along with a dude named Kerry Harnash.
sure.
And Kerry and the temple went separate ways, and Kerry did one out at the Ag Center
Right.
that was phenomenally successful.
Yeah, I
Like,
went there a couple of years ago.
oh my God, it was so successful. And then, like 2020 really messed everything up. And so there wasn't another big food festival. But then, I don't know if you remember this, but Dinner Impossible came to Asheville,
Yeah.
the television show
Oh,
with
right, right. Yeah.
Chef, what's his name? I can't remember his name right now. Robert something. Robert Irvine. Chef Robert Irvine came and he worked with Carrie Harnash
I remember,
to
yeah.
set up a little food truck competition at Rabbit Rabbit. And I think it was Bun Intended won the dessert portion of that competition. And Robert Irvine won the other thing, the food portion. Yeah.
Okay, the story, and hope I'll have to get in touch with Carrie. I hope he does it again.
I
But
hope so too. He's a
I
gum.
judged that one at the Ag Center, and
Oh,
between you
did
and
you?
I, but other people can listen to it. I don't think I'll ever do this again because I'm not a big adventurous eater, you know. And here I had to take. There were like 20 trucks. I had to taste, the food. And it was
Mhm.
tough for me. You probably would love it, but you
Blaine,
know,
you're the worst kind of judge.
no,
You are the
exactly.
worst kind of judge.
I'm telling you, I won't be a judge in that competition. The chocolate chip cookies, I was okay, but the food
Sure.
comp that
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
little.
all kinds of weird stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to, if you're a judge, another thing that I think people like to dream about is to be a food competition judge, right? So like in a restaurant, everybody's like, "Oh, I want to judge a competition." I know this from people telling me this all the time, and they think it's a lot easier than it really is.
Yeah.
It's difficult. Like even if you just take one or two bites of
Right.
something, like the Battle of the Burger, I think there were 15 competitors. So like I worked it out. It was like at the end, I did like a little math of how many bites I would take of a full burger, and I ate
Right.
three entire hamburgers
Yeah.
in a 3 hour period, and that's a lot of hamburger. Like I was kind of miserable after those, but did I ever say no?
Well,
No.
so funny you said that because the competition, I started out eating too many bites and too big bites, and then you had to figure out, you got to pace yourself over. I don't know if you had 20 trucks or something, but it was tough,
Right. Yeah, yeah. And the thing is, you show up hungry because you don't
Right.
want to eat beforehand. So the first one, especially if it's really good, you're like, dang, and you're just eating that down. But yeah, you got to pace yourself. And I I like to now be the person who organizes the event rather than being a judge. I will judge food competitions still. People still ask me to. But I also like to assemble a judges panel and make it diverse, like culturally diverse, as well as diverse in terms of like a chef, an eater, a celebrity. This year we have a drag performer named Marigold Showers, and I'm so excited about that because she dresses really outrageously. You can find her on Instagram at marigold.showers.
And Stuart, in remaining time here, talk a little bit about your writing about food and your blogging and how you got into that.
Okay. Well, prior to writing about food, I was a stay-at-home artist. I worked in my studio all day, so I'd go out to eat a lot. And then when Facebook came along, my friends started to ask me. They knew I was going out to eat a lot, and they were like, "You got to start writing reviews because there's so many restaurants opening up in Nashville." It was, I don't know if you remember, but around 2007, there started to be just an explosion of restaurants, and then 2008 kind of tampered that down a little bit, but then it just really went nuts. And so I started writing Facebook reviews, food reviews, just for my friends, and I tried to make them funny. And you know me, you see how I am on Facebook. I'm not shy about dropping an F bomb and stating my opinion. And so my friends got a real kick out of that, and they encouraged me to get published. I got published by ashvegas.com,
Sure.
Jason Sanford's wonderful news magazine. These days, he has a Substack newsletter that I encourage people to sign up for if they want to keep up with what's going on in Asheville. So Jason gave me my start, introduced me to about 8,000 of his followers, and just kind of took off from there. I kind of fell into it ass backwards, as they say, and just fell in love with writing about food. Initially, I did write negative as well as positive reviews. I quickly learned that there wasn't much value in that for me, the reader, or the restaurant. So I quickly switched and or didn't switch. I just stopped writing negative reviews, and I only focus on food that I like.
I was going to ask you that because that's a really good point you just made, Stu. That if you're eating food, then and so if you don't like it or you don't have a good experience, what you just won't write about it, which is
Yeah,
cool.
that's
Yeah,
it. That's it exactly. If And you put it correct. If I didn't like it or I didn't have a good experience, because the experience can change from visit to visit.
true.
So And I can be moody. I can show up with an attitude and nothing gonna please me, you know? So you have to give a restaurant more than one chance. And if they can't do it in three hits, you know, if you give them three at bats and they can't do it, then um, I don't know what to say. I'll be back in a couple of years, folks. But I'll never. I wrote a negative review one time of a restaurant owned by a very nice person before I met this person. And he was so nice to me about my negative review, but he explained to me how hurtful that could be to his bottom line, which affected his family and his staff. He really opened my eyes. And that's Chef Mike Moore, by the way, who used to own Seven Sows. And he invited me back, and I had a completely different, wonderful experience the second time. And
Well,
this was early on in my writing, so I learned pretty early
well,
not
and I
to.
think you're giving folks a really good piece of advice that sometimes my wife will go to a place and not have a good experience. And I said, Cynthia, you got to give it a second chance, you know.
Yeah,
And oftentimes, which is amazing, Stu, we'll like it, you know, very much the second time, but not the
absolutely.
first time.
Yeah.
One final question has to do with something else you do, quote, in your spare time, you know,
Yeah.
one of many things. And that's you also, and you mentioned, we did it in the introduction, you mentioned Asheville food tours. What are they all about?
Well, Blaine, surprise, surprise for all your young listeners out there, it's very difficult to make a living as a writer. Like, I'm sure your other guests can tell you that they either have to work super hard at it for decades to become successful, or they just do it in their spare time. I had already done that as an artist. I had worked 20 years to be successful as an artist. And I could have pursued that same route with writing, but I just didn't want to hoe that row again, you know. I'd already done it. So I just needed a job. And I hadn't had a job like a job in 20 years. And I've been an artist, you know. Great way to make a living. It's difficult but fun. It gives you a lot of freedom. But I decided I better get something in the food industry, and I thought I'd make a good host at a restaurant or something like that. And then I took a couple of food tours to write about them, and I loved the idea of a food tour. Like before I took the tour, I had very low expectations. Afterwards, I was like, "This is the greatest thing on earth." And I took them with both companies in town, and I just contacted Asheville Food Tours, and I said, "Do you need a new tour guide?" And they knew who I was. They had invited me to take the tour in the first place, and so they hired me right away. And it's a very small company. When they hired me, it doubled the size of the company, Blaine. So it's me and this guy named Patty, short for Patrick. And Patty and I run the company, and we do. And now we have another guide named Amy. And between the three of us, we are currently doing 8 tours a week.
Okay, cool. And so what does the tour entail?
Food tours are great, man. You meet a group of anywhere from 4 to 14 people, four being our minimum, 14 our max. And you basically take a walk through downtown Asheville, about a mile and a half, and you visit anywhere from 6 to 8 restaurants and other types of food places like ice cream shops. You know, we might even go to the bee charmer and taste some honey along the way. And so you just walk through Asheville. So it's like a guided tour of downtown Asheville with food stops. And our company, we do a lot of history of Asheville and architecture. I shouldn't say a lot. We do. People should take the history tours and such
Right.
and really learn about Asheville. But we talk about the prominent buildings, the Jackson Building, City Hall, the S&W Cafeteria Building, of course, because it's a food building. And we just it it's like a guided tour with food, and you get a meal or more on every tour.
And so I assume if you take this, you should also not eat breakfast or lunch that day. Just be prepared to eat.
If you're going to take one of Amy's tours, they happen at 2 in the afternoon. I would say have a very light bite in the morning. If you take one of my tours, they happen at 4 in the afternoon. I say go ahead and eat breakfast if you get up early, but don't eat lunch. And cancel your dinner reservations.
Okay. So if folks want to get in touch with you to find out about just some of this cool stuff you're doing, what's the best bet?
Well, I'm super active on social media, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can find me at Stu Helm Food Fan. So that's my moniker on across the board on all of my social media, Stu Helm Food Fan. I also have a website, stuhelmfoodfan.com. people can look up tours at ashevillefoodtours.com. And people can subscribe to my newsletter through Substack by just searching for Stu Helm.
Okay,
And I have a YouTube channel. I keep forgetting. I kickstarted my YouTube channel again. I have about 26 videos.
Okay, I've just done that too. So yeah, that's a great way to find out about Stu Helm. And Stu, as I mentioned off the air, we're going to have to get together for that. I'm going to take you to that barbecue place. One other recommendation near me, they changed owners. If you like ice cream, Hilltop Ice Cream, do you know it?
I don't know Hilltop, but I love ice cream.
It's right next to Angelo's, and it's the best. They've done such a great job with it. So I got a couple places for you to check out. We'll have to find time to do it. Stu, man, that was great.
Blaine.
Thanks an awful lot for being my guest this first half hour on the Blaine's World Show. And as Stu winds his way out of the studio, or as I kick him out officially here, let me see if I can get Stu, and we'll bring in our next guest. Stu, you be well.
Thank you, Blaine.
Okay, thanks
Blaine.
again.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So Stu winds his way out. Let's see if I can get my second guest. And he should be joining us in just a second. As my second guest works his way into the studio, I'll mention to folks they are watching the Blaine's World Show, and I think there's George. I'll be with you in our second, George. Let me just tell folks you're watching the Blaine's World Show. We're now seen each week on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. You can also see us in my Blaine's World blog. And with that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce my second guest today, and he is the famous, or should I say the infamous, George Pappas. And welcome aboard, George.
Welcome, Blaine. Thanks for having me on your show.
Okay,
great.
Just stay up close to the mic there. That was great. You can also wave to all your fans and friends in Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever you're watching George, but that's George Pappas. And I should mention that folks who don't know George is an attorney specializing in immigration and general practice. He's also a lecturer, author, devoted to clients nationwide on immigration matters from naturalization, deportation, removal proceedings, immigration waivers, appeals, and adjustment of status for family and employment-based visa holders. If you need help in immigration, George is the man. He's helped clients achieve freedom and realize their potential through devoted and zealous advocacy on their behalf for legal rights, and that's why he loves what he does. And before we talk about what you'll be talking about today, George, I should also give a shout out for the fact you are definitely the world's or the area's biggest Yankee fan. So the only thing, where's the cap? Oh, I don't see it.
Oh, it's too hot. I'm not actually. It's really hot where I am. I don't want to wear a cap, but
okay. But anyway,
it's always there in spirit. Always.
Okay, great. And I appreciate that and many other things about you. George has researched Native American history and U.S. federal Indian law extensively, has recently had a book on the subject published, Literary and Legal Genealogy of Native American Dispossession, the Marshall Trilogy Cases, 1823 to 1832. He's married to another of my favorite guests on this show, good friend Ellen Pappas, a busy theater director and actor. And the question, George, I ask, I'm trying to think, I should know, you grew up in the New York area, I remember, in Queens.
Yes, I grew up in Astoria, Queens.
Yeah. And by the way, I have to ask you before we talk about that background, so how come you weren't a Met fan?
Well, I was a Met fan, Blaine, for many years. I was a Met fan in 1969, the Miracle Mets.
Right.
All the way until 1986. But then something happened, Blaine. I hit my head and I saw the light and I became a Yankee fan. And I've been a Yankee fan since. That's what happened.
Okay. And when you were growing up as a kid, did you always know you wanted to be an attorney?
Actually, I would say from about high school onward, I wanted to be an attorney. I remember being in a play called You Can't Take It With You. And on the playbill, they asked some of the actors, what kind of aspirations they had. And I remember I wanted to be an attorney. And so it goes back a long way, yes.
Okay. And so you went undergraduate. What was your major undergraduate?
My undergraduate major was monetary economics. And that was not called a major. And I studied at the London School of Economics, where you spend 3 years specializing in a particular subject, unlike the American liberal arts system where you declare a major. So my first degree was in monetary economics, which I still love.
And so when you went to school to become an attorney, what gave you the idea to specialize in immigration law? How did you get involved in that?
Well, actually, it happened after I became an attorney. I was practicing in Charlotte, North Carolina, and around 2006, I decided that I should spend some time learning about immigration. Having grown up in an immigrant family, first generation, I felt that it was really a valuable thing for me to do. Plus, unlike other practice areas, I could move from state to state with immigration. I practice in all states because Congress, not U.S. states, regulate the regulation of immigration law. So it was very portable. I wouldn't have to take another bar exam, which is not a
Interesting.
very easy thing to do. So that's what got me into immigration around 2006.
And so you start specializing in immigration. You built up this practice, doing a lot of good work for people, really helping people. And one of the things that always inspires me most, George, about you, is when I see that you've helped somebody achieve citizen status in this country. Talk a little bit about that and what you do when somebody, quote, becomes a citizen.
It's probably the highlight of my career.
Yeah, just
when
love
I
it.
help someone become a U.S. citizen because they've traveled such a long journey to get to that plateau, to that level of achievement and success. So to be there when they are awarded, or I'm sorry, when they're approved for citizenship, to me is the highlight of what I do. Everything else leads up to citizenship. So if I'm at a citizenship ceremony, I couldn't be more proud of my clients. Putting my head, down at night on a pillow, knowing that I've helped someone become a U.S. citizen is priceless. So the feeling is beyond words because it means so much not only to the individual but to their family. It gives them opportunities they didn't have before, and everybody has a different background. They could be coming from a war zone. They could be coming from a place that had a climate catastrophe. There are so many reasons why people in war, why people come here, and for them to get in a line where they become citizens, and I'm there to guide them at that final stage, is really the climax of what I do. It's really great, Blaine. It's wonderful to watch these people blossom in front of your very own eyes. They're like new flowers. They've been reborn.
What I love watching is and seeing the pictures you post is, that to your credit, you're there every step of the way, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
and it's like almost like a graduation. But you go there, and it's such, I get such a warm feeling about them, hugging you and so excited, the whole family, and so that's really nice. You make a point to go to every, if possible, as many of the actual happenings when it takes place.
Absolutely. If I can physically be there, I will be there. I'll be the one taking pictures. I'll be the one giving them a hug. And you know, immigration and the process of immigration is very, very stressful. So when they're actually given citizenship, that stress just starts to melt off their soul, off their body. That relief is remarkable. And you make friends for life. It's not a business. It's a relationship. Many people don't realize, especially in immigration law, when we take on a case, it's like getting married. We go to bed with clients, we take showers with clients, we think about them 24/7. It's not a 9 to 5 job. And so their worry, their concerns, their stress becomes my concern, becomes my stress. And unless you have empathy, there is no way that you can effectively be a strong advocate as an immigration attorney. Empathy is one of the key attributes of doing this work. Absolutely.
And to your credit, I've always been impressed by the fact that, as you indicated, you actually stay in touch with these people. It's not like you get your fee and then you're out of their lives. It seems, you're always in touch with them and you're communicating with them and their families, and that's so marvelous that you do that.
As much as I can, I stay in touch with them. Obviously, some move on with their lives.
Right.
They don't want to think about immigration. It was such a journey and an uphill battle for them. So, but where I can, I always try to maintain contact with these folks. They're like my children. I don't want to leave them.
Talk about George Pappas, the author. So,
Okay.
at what point in time, among the many different things you've done, did you decide you wanted to write a book?
Well, around 2006, I was representing undocumented children. Way before you saw the surge today on the southern border. I was doing it in 2006. And I felt that would be an area for a PhD. And I reached out to Birkbeck College, University of London, and I proposed writing a PhD about undocumented children coming into the United States. And as soon as I started the PhD and I started doing the research, I really quickly realized that not only are refugees displaced in between nations, they're also displaced internally. And when I started reading about the internal displacement of refugees, for me, an epiphany occurred. I realized, wait a minute, Native Americans have been dispossessed in their own country. We don't call them refugees, but in my mind, in that instant, they became my refugees. So I switched, Blaine, from focusing on undocumented children to focusing on our Native Americans. In one brief instant, it's as if the lie about Native Americans came upon me. And I was really intrigued with that. And so I decided to re-educate myself. It took about a year or two to really go over the basics about Native American history within the context of the American continent. And that's what led me to researching Native American history. It was discovering how I had been educated in the worst possible way about these people. And so from immigration, I segued into Native American research. And to this day, I continue.
And not only being not knowledgeable about it, if you're not knowledgeable about it, you can imagine the rest of the country. Nobody is knowledgeable about it.
Absolutely. And that's the problem. That's the problem. And part of what we'll talk about today, we'll talk about that ignorance. It's a real problem for Native Americans.
What's fascinating, George, is the fact that, you're looking at this, but you trace it back to, I guess, in the 1820s, and talk about what was the key happening at that point in time that most people, even to this day, don't know enough about.
Well, actually, 1823 was the infamous case called Johnson versus Macintosh. It was a case where Chief Justice John Marshall wrote a leading opinion in that case. But the genesis of that case easily goes back to the 1400s with the Vatican, because the Vatican in the 1400s, Blaine, created international law that basically said to the King of Portugal and the King of Spain, if you go out in the world and you see non-Christians, they're not human. You can seize them, you can conquer them, you can take their land. And that became international law. That doctrine of discovery, which is what it became called, eventually filtered into the 1823 case from Chief Justice John Marshall. He imported this international law to legally justify how the United States owns their land. And how he did it in that ruling was basically to say, look, upon discovery, we own the land. It was that simple. And those that are here, we call them Indians at the time, we will grant them a title called occupancy. So John Marshall said, you'll become tenants, but we'll be the landlords. Since we arrived here, we put our flag down, we own the land, but we're good guys, and we're going to let you be tenants, and you can stay on your land for as long as you want, but when you're ready to sell, you can only sell to us. That 1823 case, Blaine, is still the law today. That case is quoted and used by the Supreme Court and many other courts in 2021. This is not ancient history. It's remarkable, but that fictional creation of dehumanizing Native Americans to be tenants is still the law today. So yes, we go back to the 1820s and the 1830s, but it really has a basis and genesis all the way back to the 1500s.
And remember, once over lunch, you were teaching me a little bit about this, and I appreciate the fact. And you tell me about the fact that so the Indians could stay there when they sold it. And what was it, George? I think they were promised, I guess, a reasonable price so they'd be taken care of. But the reality, they never were. Is that correct?
They never were. Every
Right.
treaty signed by the United States with Native American nations has been violated by the United States. We used treaties. When you sign a treaty between the United States and someone else, you're talking about a foreign government. We treated Native Americans as foreign governments, whether they were Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Catawba. We signed treaties with them. We made promises to them, promises which we never kept. What actually happened is that through George Washington and onward through Andrew Jackson, certainly Jackson didn't want to hear about treaties, but certainly with George Washington, treaties were used as a fig leaf to avoid war, buy time, pacified Native Americans to say, look, we're going to sign a treaty. This part of the country's yours, this part's ours, knowing that meanwhile, Scots-Irish settlers were encroaching and trespassing on Native American law, and the US government was powerless to stop it. And then they would have to sign a new treaty. So the treaties were just a sham. And they finally stopped writing treaties around 1871 when Congress said, we no longer are going to write treaties with Native Americans, but the treaties that we signed, we will honor. So, yeah, we made a lot of promises that we did not keep.
And talk about what you just said there, George, about not honoring. For example, what was the United States supposed to do that they didn't do?
They were, first of all, to recognize that they were not giving Native Americans land. They were already here.
Point well taken.
They needed to recognize that the land that they recognized as being Native American was Native American. Two, what they weren't doing was enforcing the treaties. They didn't have a standing army to go in there and police it. And they knew that the settlers that were on the frontier were encroaching upon Native American land. The other things they didn't do was to give them the food, the machinery, and all the other foodstuffs and dry goods that they promised to Native Americans to become self-sufficient, and of course money. As we got into the 19th century, late 19th century, the U.S. Marshals or the representatives of the U.S. government basically blackmailed families and said, look, we're not going to give you food rations unless you send your child to a boarding school. That's how treaties were used against Native Americans. It was a horrible situation. And those boarding schools were around up until the 1970s, Blaine, and that's current news today. So all the things that we promised in the treaties were not promised and were not delivered. And countless people starved, dispossessed, because those treaties were not honored. The amount of corruption that filtered into the treaty system was huge. American contractors would overprice something. They would take the goods that were destined for Native Americans, mainly food. And the food they did deliver was of such poor quality. It was a horrendous environment for Native Americans.
And talk also what you just mentioned about the schools. From what I understand, that they'd have these schools, and then the kids would be taken from the parents and forced to go to the schools. What was that all about?
We decided in the 1880s, Blaine, that the way to civilize Native Americans was to detach the children from the parents and kill the culture. We considered their culture savage and barbaric. So if we could take their children away forcibly, we could then create a whole new generation of where Native American children can learn skills from construction. Women can learn domestic arts of sewing and cooking. We cut their hair. We prohibited them from having their language in these schools. But remember, they were forced. 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and on were forced to leave from their families and go to these to these boarding schools, say from South Dakota to the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. I mean, this was forced ethnic cleansing. That's what we would call it today, ethnic cleansing. And those boarding schools were horrific in terms of environment. The students weren't allowed, they couldn't wear their native attire. Their food was horrible. Their death rates were extremely high. The amount of children that died at these boarding schools was astronomical. Now they're uncovering hundreds, if not thousands, in Canada. They're doing the same here. This is with a technology that goes over the grave areas. So many children died at these schools. Many ran away through desperation, trying to get home. They were caught. So the boarding school was basically a modern day, from late 19th century to the late 20th century, a modern form of ethnic cleansing. It was horrible.
What happened in the 1970s that stopped this?
The schools still were around through the 1970s, where the tribes would send their children there. In the 1970s, they were not being forced because of food rations, but they realized at a certain point that they had a better chance. The kids, the thought was that the children would at least get a square meal, have some degree of skills to learn. That was why some of the Native American families later on voluntarily sent them to boarding schools. But the horror show was waiting for them there. The food was horrible. The environment was restrictive. It was very militaristic. And the disease, the way the children caught diseases at this place was horrific. And these were primarily run by church groups. That's another dimension of this horror show. The sexual abuse that occurred at these places was horrific. We read about the Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts with their sexual abuse lawsuits. What happened at these boarding schools was basically tantamount to a modern day concentration camp for children. It was horrible.
And as you're talking about it, I'm shaking my head because very few people know about this. I think shortly before you and I started speaking about it, I became a little aware of it. But you mentioned, for example, John Marshall. So I know that John Marshall was a Supreme Court justice, right? Was he the Chief Justice?
He was the Chief Justice. He's looked upon as the founding father of American jurisprudence.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you about that. So John Marshall had that reputation, but this was not a favorable part of his reputation then, or these cases.
These cases are not reviewed in law school. Maybe one is, but I went to several law schools. We didn't learn anything about this. Nothing.
Yeah. Well, no, you didn't study it at all. You didn't. Unfortunately, you didn't study the Supreme Court too much either. Not necessarily in law school, but in colleges and history classes. As we're seeing now, the Supreme Court is a very significant, piece of power in this country. But John Marshall then. So what was his, I guess, thinking, if you can guess at it, or idea behind these cases in terms of his rulings then?
His rulings laid the foundation for federal Indian law in the United States. The Johnson versus Macintosh case established the legal title for the American Republic. A later case called Georgia versus Cherokee Nation, or Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, John Marshall created a fiction. He declined to hear an appeal from the Cherokee Nation against the state of Georgia. Georgia was trying to impose state law on Cherokee land. The Cherokee sued, appealed to the Supreme Court, and Justice Marshall said, "You don't have standing to sue. You're really not a foreign nation, even though we signed treaties with you. You're actually a domestic dependent nation." That phrase was created by John Marshall. And from that phrase, what's called the trust doctrine emerged, where we had a trust obligation to take care of Native Americans, as if that's what the treaties required. And then in the final case, Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, Marshall said, wait a minute, Cherokee Nation is sovereign versus the states. Georgia's law does not have jurisdiction over Cherokee. Only the federal government does. And those were the three big cases, the trilogy cases that John Marshall wrote one of the leading opinions for. And those cases have basically survived throughout the 21st century today. It is a racist-based jurisprudence, and that racist base has been camouflaged in many ways from the 19th century to the 20th century to the current period. One of the things I wanted to just touch upon was the issue of people saying, well, this is history. This is bygone. Let's move on now. This is the past. There's nothing we can do. The tragedy is it's not the past, Blaine. It's current events. The genocide, the dehumanization of Native Americans continues to this very day. I'll give you one statistic just to put this in perspective. 5,100 Native American women today are missing. 5,100. The U.S. Attorney's Office has only prosecuted 90 of those cases. That means over 5,000 cases have never been examined or prosecuted. What's the problem here? The problem here is Chief Justice Rehnquist, one of the latest justices, and Justice Ginsburg, ironically, basically say that the Native American nations in the United States are not civilized enough because they don't have a court system. So we're not going to allow them to prosecute criminals on their own land. Only the U.S. government can do that. So only the U.S. government, except for domestic violence, has jurisdiction to prosecute these criminals. So if a policeman, an Indian policeman on a tribal land, captures someone who's been accused of rape, they have no jurisdiction to bring them to the tribal court. They have to hand them over to the U.S. Marshal or the U.S. Attorney's Office and convince the U.S. Attorney that there's a case here. Out of 5,100, the U.S. Attorney has only taken 90 of these cases. So that's just one example of missing Native American women who have been allowed to be assaulted, murdered, raped, because of the way the Supreme Court has said Native nations are not civilized enough to protect due process. They don't have our type of court system. We'll take control. By taking control of prosecuting these criminals, Blaine, no resources go to tribal councils to prosecute any of their offenders under their jurisdiction, But more importantly, the resources to prosecute these criminals on native land is minimized when it's by the U.S. Attorney's Office. So with impunity, non-tribal members know that they can go onto tribal lands and commit murder and rape and get away with it. And they do. This is a current day tragedy. That's just one example.
Do you see this changing at all?
Nope. And the reason I say no is that there's no consensus that's been built up in the mass media. Let me give you an example. We had one missing white girl that was on a trip with her boyfriend a year ago, and it made national news. I'm not discounting her tragedy. She was murdered, but that's one. We have 5,100 here, and we don't even know about it. So the media is completely ignoring this problem. They publish articles here and there, but until tribal sovereignty is returned to Native nations, this type of problem won't stop. And tribal sovereignty not only means self-determination, it means under the treaties that are signed by the US government, adequate resources need to be given for police training, domestic violence training, and other type of court support in order to prosecute. You need an effective trained police force. You need a court system. You need a whole infrastructure that the Native tribes don't have because we took it away from them. So that's why in the short term, I don't see an improvement here. I see a continued assault on Native American self-determination and sovereignty, just on the missing Native women's issue alone. I haven't even touched poverty, environmental injustice, economic exploitation. I haven't even talked about those issues, which are occurring today.
So how does change come about, George?
Change comes about where the U.S. government returns self-determination, real self-determination, to Native tribes. The problem is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a case called Oliphant in 1978, dehumanized tribal councils from having jurisdiction over criminal prosecution. So until we have new legislation, because the Supreme Court's not going to change, Congress has to pass new laws that say tribal councils have jurisdiction to prosecute all criminals on their land. And until that happens, there will be no improvement. So the pathway to improvement is congressional legislation, not the Supreme Court.
And as you know, I kind of read a good deal, and I have to say, until the show, that hasn't been too much on my radar screen. In terms of, I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, you name it, and I see nobody talking about needing legislation for this particular happening.
Yeah, I mean, what we're not taught in schools, Blaine, is we're taught there's a federal government, there's a state government, there's also tribal governments. There's 3 layers of government in this country. We've signed over 350 treaties with Native Americans. They've all been violated. The most recent example is the protest at Standing Rock Sioux in South Dakota. That protest against the Access Pipeline was a pipeline that was going right under the water source for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. It was going through tribal ancestral grounds. It was also going through grounds that was guaranteed by the U.S. government in 1868 under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, where the U.S. government was defeated. And in a defeat treaty, a negotiation, they gave South Dakota or North Dakota, what we call that today, land to the Native Americans. But we've allowed these private corporations to just run right through Native land, even though treaties were signed. So to this day, the treaty violations continue. You have some token events where some land is given back to Native tribes, but what the problem today is assault on Native American self-determination. With no self-determination, the Native society cannot hold together. Poverty cannot be eradicated until Congress gives title to the land that Native Americans owned. They can't leverage the resources under their land to build businesses. They can't get a loan, Blaine, because they don't have what we call fee simple title. We took it away from them. Native Americans sit on one of the most valuable deposits of natural resources in this country, yet they don't own it. If they owned it, economic recovery and boom would be their catchphrase. They would have such growth. It would be phenomenal. And many times throughout history, they have prospered, especially the Cherokee. The Cherokee, after the Trail of Tears in 1838 and being forced to march from North Carolina to Oklahoma, 5,000 people died along the way, Blaine. That was a march of death. They still, after that march, were able to rebuild their society. rebuild their economy until the Civil War in the United States dismantled them again. So Native Americans have proven they are resilient. They are here today. They have not vanished. That's the other myth, that they're no longer here. They're very much here. They're everywhere. We have over 2.5 million Native American people in the United States. We have over 553 Native American nations inside the United States. So, but until Congress gives them self-determination, the power to control their sovereignty, none of these improvements can occur. There's the problem.
And George, the sad thing, just listening to this, is that he said not only isn't it happening, but I'm just not seeing it. The people, aside from George Pappas, aren't talking about it. It's just, it's a shame, but it's the case. George, let me ask you, closing here, if people do want to hear you talk about it, I was blessed a couple of years ago, I saw you do a presentation on this topic. Do you have any upcoming presentations coming up?
Not in the short term. I don't think so. I usually lecture at universities about this. If I do have any upcoming lectures or presentations about this, certainly they can find about it on my website, which is Liberty Immigration USA. That's my law firm, libertyimmigrationusa.com. That's an easy place for them to see if I'm going to give a presentation on Native American history. I've also got a Facebook presence for the book, The Literary and Legal Genealogy of Native American Dispossession. They can go on Facebook, they'll see announcements there. But nothing in the short term. I'm working on that. I'd like to talk more about it because, like you say, most people are not aware of it.
Well, please keep me informed because I'll post it in my blog. I'll post it on Facebook as well. We'll post it on this channel as well. But let me ask you, George, is there, aside from reading your book, what's a good way for the audience to get more information about this topic?
There are many books about Native American interpretations of American history. Roseanne Oxbar has written a beautiful book about the indigenous history of the United States. That would be a great book for them to kickstart their journey about learning what the real history of Native American culture and relationships with the U.S. government is. Roseanne Oxbar, I think it's called The Indigenous History of the United States. It's a great starting point. They can get it anywhere. They can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble. That's a great book. It's very accessible.
Well, anyway, George, I'd like to thank you for being my guest the second half hour on the BLAINESWORLD Show. Also to my guest the first half hour, Stu Helm, and to my producer, Cappy Tassetti. Look forward to having you join me next week on BLAINESWORLD via Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, my BLAINESWORLD blog. And George, I look forward to catching up with you in the near future. As I sign off here, just stay with me a second and I can wrap up. Thanks, George. As always, a pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure.